Okay, welcome back to Renaissance this afternoon. And in this session, we're going to have two talks. A great talk on ebooks from Vicki, who's going to go first, followed by really interesting stuff on accessibility from James. So, Vicki, let's throw to your talk.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Vicki Murley, and this is Connect Everyone, Opening New Worlds with iBooks and Accessibility Technologies. So I really enjoyed the lunchtime session where everyone got up and said a few words about themselves, but I still want to do a quick survey. Who here is a developer of a game that has a character with a backstory? So for example, this is a game called Moby's Revenge, and it's about a whale that gets free from its SeaWorld-like pen and then takes revenge upon its captors. Does anyone have a game with a character in it that has a backstory? Okay, a few people. What about an app that teaches people something? This is the Appetites app, and it, of course, teaches people how to cook. It can be anything. It doesn't have to be cooking. But does your app teach someone? Okay, a few people. This last category, I think, is going to catch the rest of you. Who has a skill? Any kind of skill. This is Objective-C, but it could be public speaking. It could be surfing. It could be any skill or knowledge that you feel like you could impart to someone else. So who falls into that category? Okay, most people. If you fall into any of those categories, which I think most of you do, there's a chance for you to connect with even more users by publishing an ebook. And this is the application icon for iBooks, which is the ebook reader on iOS and OS X. So ebooks have really changed how publishing works in the last few years. It's open to everyone. It used to be that to publish a book, you had to get approached by a big publisher that had been around for 100 years, and they would give you an advance to work on stuff over a period of years. But now with electronic publishing, it's very easy to just make something up all on your own and put it out there for people to enjoy. It's also possible for individuals because there's a lot less risk than with a paper publication. You don't have to worry about printing costs, shipping costs. You don't have to worry about inventory lying around. All of these things make it very easy for you to publish your own book. And frankly, I think it's a platform that is really ripe for innovation. So many of the ebooks that we still see today are just electronic translations of the paper version that don't really leverage the digital platform or have anything that makes them better than the paper version. When really, it's completely possible to make an app-like experience inside of a book. And I think the people in the room here who are great app makers are likely to also be great bookmakers. So I feel uniquely qualified to talk about this topic because, as I mentioned at lunchtime, I worked at Apple for more than 10 years on a few different engineering teams. I worked on Safari and also the iPhone, and I spent more than 5 years as the Safari Technologies evangelist there. So if you ever went to WWDC, you may have seen me there. About a year ago, I left to start my own company, which is called Sprightly Books, and I helped a lot of clients make interesting ebooks. And at some point, I decided that I wanted to write and publish my own book. And since my area of expertise is web technologies, I decided to write it about CSS transforms. That came out in October of 2013. People really liked it, so much so that I'm going to do a second one where the focus is CSS animation. So I feel uniquely qualified to be here and also really happy to talk to you today. So what you're going to learn by the end of my session, I only have about half an hour, so it's tough to get into all the technical details. But I'd like for you to learn all about the different types of ebooks and how to choose the right one for the objectives that you want to achieve. What makes an ebook stand out from the rest? I mentioned before, so many seem just like translations of the paper version, but there's a lot you can do to make yours special. And finally, You're all used to marketing your apps, et cetera, but I have a few tips from my own experience for ebook development and marketing. So getting into the first point here, ebooks are built off of a standard called EPUB. And when you create an EPUB, it's basically a folder full of files. And they're the type of files that you're used to seeing when you create a website. XHTML, CSS, JavaScript, images and video would also be in this folder. There's also some files that are specific to the EPUB format. And those are used for things to specify, for example, the table of contents, the order of elements within the book. All of those files basically go into a folder. You zip it up, and you give it an EPUB extension, and now you have an EPUB. So it's sort of like a website just zipped up into a bundle. That's why my area of expertise translates so well from websites to books. So an EPUB is the basis for an ebook. And from that, you can come up with a lot of different examples. You can make a novel. You can make a children's book. You can make a book like mine. You can make a book like Michelle Obama's, American Grown. There's really a lot possible, but they all boil down to the same thing. So getting into each of those examples a little more deeply, if we look at a novel, that's what's referred to as a flowing book. And it, of course, uses EPUB as its foundation. Inside your EPUB bundle, what you're going to see is sort of one long XHTML file that is all the content for, let's say, a chapter. And then the ebook reader, like the iBooks app, for instance, is going to break up that chapter into pages. So it's going to paginate your content. In a flowing book, you can embed images, which is pretty expected. But you can also embed things like audio and video, which I think is pretty cool. And you can also use CSS to make this kind of book look great. And this is something that I wish people would do more of. All the books that I've novel or collections of short stories like this one, they're really not leveraging CSS enough just to make their book stand out just a little bit. So some things that you can do, you can embed your own web font. Then users can switch to the other built-in fonts, but always be able to get back to your original fonts that you specified. Or you can use, there's a lot of CSS you could use inside a book like this, but one of the most interesting one is a few CSS pseudo elements, like first letter and first line. So you might make the first letter of each chapter a larger, more decorated character. Or you might make the first line all bold text, or all italic text, or all purple text. It could be whatever you want. So you can use those CSS pseudo elements to style the repeating elements throughout your book. A book like this one is widely publishable. Even if you have an old black and white Kindle, you can still read a novel on that type of device. So that is, if you're looking to get out to a very, very wide audience, this is the type of EPUB that you might want to create. The second type of book that I'd like to explain is called a fixed layout book, also based on EPUB. This type of EPUB is going to be used to make a picture book or a children's book. And in this case, each page within the book is its own separate web page. I talked about a flowing book where a chapter might just be one long XHTML file that's then paginated by the app. In this example, you're going to have one XHTML file for each page. So that's kind of nice because it gives you complete control over the layout. And another piece of control that you have here is that you can lock the orientation to either portrait or landscape. Inside of a fixed layout book, you can do things like, if your reader supports EPUB 3, you can do things like execute JavaScript, use CSS animations. You can even store a piece of data in local storage. Lots of things that you can do inside of a web page can be done inside of an ebook like this one. The HTML5 canvas tag for dynamic drawing will work inside an EPUB like this. It's really pretty powerful. Different readers have varying levels of support for kind of newer technologies. I mentioned EPUB 3. That's sort of the latest version of EPUB, like HTML5 is the latest version of HTML. And not every reader out there supports EPUB 3. So if you're making a book like this, you're going to be targeting an audience that has sort of up-to-date software, and in some cases hardware too. For this type of book, the iBooks app also provides a feature called Read Aloud. And this allows you to create a custom audio track where you or someone you know is reading the text of the book, and each word that you're speaking can be synced up to the text inside the book through a technology called Smile, S-M-I-L. So in this book, you can download the sample on the iBooks store, and Gwyneth Paltrow is actually reading brown bear, what do you see? And as she speaks each word, you're seeing the corresponding piece of text highlight on the page. So that's not quite an accessibility feature. There's still the built-in screen reader that people might use, but this is more of kind of a icing on the cake kind of enhancement that people like to add. The third type of book that you could create is a book that you have created with iBooks Author. So when you export a book from iBooks Author, you're going to get a .ibooks file. But it's really, under the hood, it's really still an EPUB. There's just some special sauce thrown in there to do various types of things. For example, you can add a keynote presentation to a book that you create in iBooks Author, whereas you couldn't do that in a standard EPUB. iBooks Author allows you to create a book that is like a flowing book in portrait orientation, but like a fixed layout book when the iPad is rotated to landscape orientation. So this is a screenshot from E.O. Wilson's Life on Earth. And this is what a page looks like viewed in landscape orientation. Once this is rotated, the two interactive elements on the page, which are indicated with little circle controls, are going to be minimized to the margin here. So they're still accessible, but they're not laid out in the page as you exactly specified when you were creating the book. iBooks Author also allows you to create a book that is locked to a certain orientation. And I think that this feature, where it was sort of both types of EPUB in one, like a flowing EPUB in portrait and a fixed layout EPUB in landscape, I think that was a feature that was attractive to a lot of people in the beginning. But now, as I look at more and more books that are created with iBooks Author, I'm seeing most of them are locked to one orientation or another. There are really a few reasons for that. Number one, it's only one set of designs. If you're creating a book that works in both orientations, you have to come up with two designs. And I think in general, people just like having fine-grained control over where they're placing each and every element. So this is what the interface for iBooks Author looks like. And we're looking at my book inside of iBooks Author. And it has a lot of the controls that you're used to seeing in other apps from Apple. You can drop in text fields, shapes, charts, tables, etc. And there's also a set of built-in interactive widgets. So there is an image gallery, which users can swipe through a set of images, which can also be either inline or full screen. There's the media widget, which you can use to embed audio and video. There's a quiz widget, which you can use to create quizzes at the end of each chapter. I already mentioned that there's a Keynote widget, so you can make something in Keynote, which Keynote can really be used for a lot of rich animations, and then drop that into your iBooks Author book and have that animation working. There's an interactive image, 3D, which is Collada under the hood, scrolling sidebar, just another UI element, a popover, always super valuable, and my personal favorite, the HTML widget, which allows you to just write some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, encapsulate it in a certain file format, and drop it into your book. And that kind of gives you the most customized version of interactivity. if you're making a book inside of iBooks Author, there's a few things to remember. The first is that the terms of use are such that a book made with IBA can only be sold in the iBooks store. So you could make a book in IBA and give it away for free to anyone, but if you want to sell it, you can only sell it through the iBooks store. Books made with iBooks Author are iPad only. And the HTML widget is full screen only. And there's a sad face here because iBooks Author is a lot of taking something and dropping it into the page. And sometimes you want something to be happening across the page. Like maybe you're making a book about underwater sea adventures, and you would like a fish to swim across the page. Well, you would need an inline HTML widget in order to do that. As it is right now, the way the HTML widget works is you tap a thumbnail on the screen, and then it goes full screen and takes over the whole view. I mentioned kind of just a fun animation, like a fish swimming across the screen, but an inline HTML widget could be useful for so many things. Like there was a time we were like, oh, we'd really like to have just a segmented control that we could switch between these two views. We sure could use an inline HTML widget. So it really is, not just for gratuitous animations throughout the page. It would be useful for creating your own custom controls. But unfortunately, that's not something that you can do inside of IBA right now. As far as accessibility goes, James is going to touch on this a lot more. But I just wanted to mention that the iBooks app has accessibility built in. It works with the built-in screen reader. In iBooks Author, as you're dropping in different widgets, there's always a little field to fill in an accessibility description. And that is a really quick way to make your book accessible to a lot of people. And for HTML components, both inside of iBooks Author and if you did a straight-up EPUB, you would use ARIA, which is a technology that you would use in a web page to make it accessible. You use that same technology inside of a book. OK, so that covers the different types of books that you could create. And now I want to talk a little bit about how to make your book stand out from the rest. So as I mentioned, eventually, after working with other people on their projects for a while, I decided to create my own. And when I released it, people really responded positively to it. People really liked it. And that not only made me feel great about what I was doing, but it also made me get a better understanding of what differentiates a good ebook from a great ebook, or a great ebook from a good ebook, I should have said. What makes an ebook stand out? I think it really boils down to two things, and that is great design and relevant and responsive interactivity. So let's talk about the first one, great design. You already know, the three types of books that you could create. And of course, this sounds obvious, but you're going to want to make an early decision about which type of book you're going to create. What is most important to you? Getting your book out to the widest number of people, so you want to be on Kindle platforms as well? Well, then you're not going to use iBooks Author. You're going to make just a straight-up EPUB. If you want people who have very old readers to be able to read your book, you need to make a flowing book. The second thing that I think about a lot in great design for a book is, what's my point of view? And with this, I don't mean above or below or from the right or left. I don't mean that point of view. And I don't mean the writing point of view, which is first person, third person, et cetera. I mean, what is your identity that you're looking to impart on this self-published book of yours? So a great example, I think, comes to us from reality television, Top Chef. If you've ever watched this show, all these people are competing and preparing these dishes, and they put them in front of these judges, and the judges either praise them or scoff at it. But one thing they talk about a lot is finding your point of view. Are you the chef that cooks, deep-fried Southern soul food, or are you the chef that cooks modern California cuisine? You really have to identify who you are figure that out and then impart that into the work that you are creating. I can tell you a little bit about finding my own personal point of view. I knew that I would have to write something that was on a technical topic, because that's the only skill that I have to share with the world. So that part was kind of taken care of for me. But then I started to think about other components of great books that I had seen. And I had always thought about a lot of the books I really liked had amazing photography. You know, it's so easy a lot of the time to look through a cooking book and see like a lot of amazing food photography. And I was kind of thinking, oh, it's too bad that I'm not making a cookbook, that I don't have a skill in that area, because the content lends itself so well to like a great design. Even though I wasn't going to do a book on cooking, I still wanted to incorporate some really beautiful photography into my book and make it pleasing to look at. The second component that I knew I wanted to have was useful and purposeful interactivity. So I found a great designer to work with, and you're going to hear from him later in the week. His name's Peter Noel. And we sort of started looking around for great photography. And we started coming across really beautiful images of San Francisco. It's a beautiful city, especially at dusk. There's another image from the book and one more of the Golden Gate Bridge at night. And we started thinking, this kind of works. You know, these photographs are really beautiful. The book is about CSS transforms, which is all about positioning something in space, like rotating it, translating it, scaling it, skewing it. So there's sort of a connection between transforms and architecture. And that seems kind of interesting and something that we should explore a little more. Then we started coming up with these landing page graphics for each chapter landing page that, again, were sort of architecture inspired. And then, you know, things began to build from there. We had to choose a color palette from the book, and we chose this beautiful, again, blueprint-inspired blue, which I think was a great choice, because when people open the book, this is one of the first things that they see. And I'm not sure how it looks on the monitor, but in the actual book, it's just very rich and beautiful, and people have like almost an emotional response to it, which is kind of cool for a book on CSS. So, you know, throughout this process, I kind of identified my own point of view, which is I'd like to make interactive technical books which are also beautiful. And that was something that I didn't see a lot of people doing, and so I was very excited about it. So I encourage you, you know, as you're going through the process, of course you want to share your knowledge, but you also want to discover your point of view and share that point of view with readers. I also wanted to have relevant and responsive interactivity, and I think that this is really the second component of a great ebook, because I think people still are expecting that an ebook is a digital version of what they see on paper. The paper version only lets the reader engage one sense, which is their sight. Unless it's an old book and it smells a little bit from old paper, then they're engaging another one. Some people really like that. But typically, there's just one sense engaged, and that's sight. The iPad, you know, people love it because they're always interacting with it. They're always engaging another sense, which is touch. And you should really be utilizing that inside of an ebook that you create. So this is an example of one of the interactive widgets that we created, and it's showing, it's illustrating a 3D transform on this cube, which will scale the cube in the X direction, the Y direction, and the Z direction as you as you drag the thumbs right and left on the little sliders on the bottom left corner. And this cube is also rotated a little bit and tilted so that you can actually see the transforms happening. And then as you drag the sliders, the code inside the box is updated. So you really get a sense of what is happening to the box as the code is changed. And you can sort of see in the code exactly what's happening on screen. And this is, you know, so much better than just reading a piece of text that says you can scale in the X direction, and you know, once it gets past 0, it's going to flip. When you actually see the cube kind of changing in those ways, it's very, very powerful. And People who already know this technology have told me that they really enjoyed using these widgets. So I thought that was pretty cool. So this is an example of very purposeful interactivity that's tied very tightly to the subject matter. But fun is also an acceptable purpose for interactivity. And you'll have to bear with me on this next example. It was the most fun example that I saw. I look at a lot of eBooks just to see what other people are doing. And this was a widget that I definitely remember. It's in a book from Demi Lovato, who you probably don't know unless you are a teenage girl or have a teenage girl as a daughter. But this is just like a fun widget where you can choose nail colors from the left and drag them onto this hand, and then they update on the hand, and then you can drag decorations from the right. This isn't, splitting the atom here. It's really just designed to be fun. So my book is, tied to CSS transforms and updating this code or whatever, and that's very purposeful. But fun is really an acceptable purpose for interactivity as well. Just remember, in a book that is teaching something, try to use your interactivity to reinforce a lesson. Don't just have it for the sake of it. So often it's easy to add eye candy. In a book that's teaching something, try to make the interactivity purposeful. Think of all the times that you have learned something by doing it. iOS 7 storyboarding is probably a great example. There are a lot of videos out there that you're dragging around windows and connecting things, etc. But it's not until you actually sit down and do it with your own project that you really understand it. Writing code is another great example. You can read and read and read about how to write a certain piece of code, but until you do it, you don't truly understand it. So try to remember that as you're designing the interactivity for your book. Finally, I have just a few tips on ebook development and marketing. I think that if you're not a designer, you should definitely hire one, because I did, and it worked out very, very well for me. I have some design ideas. I think I have good taste after working at Apple for 10 years, but it's hard for me to make things from scratch. So I really needed someone to assist me with that part of the process. And when you're choosing a designer, I have quite a few tips on this, because I think it's really important to team up with the right person. I think the first thing to think about is, how much control are you willing to give up? Some people want to just throw something over the wall and get something back and be done with it. And that is perfectly okay. I know a lot of people are like that, and it works for a lot of people. Some people don't want to have any input into the design process. Maybe that's you. You need to find someone then who is going to take over the whole thing and who you trust to execute your vision. When you're hiring a designer, I think it's important to determine, if you do plan on working a little more collaboratively, do you have similar tastes and common sensibilities? A great question you can ask is, what do you think of iOS 7? I think it's a little less polarizing now, but when it first came out, it seemed like people either loved it or hated it. If you loved it and you're looking to hire someone, you probably want them to love it too. It kind of says that you have some similar sensibilities there. And finally, do they understand your vision? Can you talk to them for a little while and kind of tell them what you have in mind, and can they repeat it back to you? And does it sound sort of like what you're thinking? I think all of these things are important when you're finding a designer to work with. When you do find that person, if you're working collaboratively, remember that you hired them for a reason. Trust them when they are putting their foot down, because they probably know what they're doing. They're doing this job, 7 days a week, whereas you're probably just dabbling in it if you're not a designer by trade, like myself. I think it's really important to learn to communicate with a designer beyond, I don't like it. So you may see, they may choose a font for your book that looks like this. And you may think, I don't like it. But until you give them specific feedback, they can't really make a better choice for you. So better feedback, I think, might be something like, I'd like something a little more modern looking or a little more fun. It doesn't have to be the technical jargon that designers use, like I would prefer a sans serif font or something like that. You can use words like more modern, more fun, et cetera, and then they can help you make a better, that will help them make a better choice for you. Even if it is a collaborative effort, if there are a few important things to you, it's important to hold your ground, but also be able to defend your reasoning. I've worked with people in the past where, you might recommend that their book be locked to landscape or something, for example. And they had it in mind that they wanted it to be portrait orientation. And you might have a lot of justification to switch it to landscape. Like, I think we can fit more text on a page. This layout works better. People are more used to this, this UI, et cetera. And they may come back to you and just say, well, I just think it should be portrait. Like if you're going to stand your ground on a few things, you need to also be able to back it up. So once you've got a designer, or if you are the designer, and you actually start working, I would recommend starting small. We think of books as these 2-inch wide things that are sitting on our bookshelf, but your first book doesn't have to be 300 pages long. It doesn't have to be 100 pages long, especially if it has a lot of interactive elements in it. My first book was 50 pages long, and people were still like, oh my God, you published a book, that's amazing. You're the expert on this topic now. And that felt great. I mentioned all the different types of books that you could create. IBA for iBooks is a really great starting point, especially if you're not familiar with web technologies and that isn't something that you have time to get up to speed on. The drag and drop interface in IBA will take you a long way. Even if you're starting small, present something that is the level of quality that you plan to maintain going forward. Even if it's short, make sure that it's really, really good. A tip specifically for writing, it's very hard, for me at least, to sit down and write for 8 hours a day and just not leave your seat. It's very hard for me to do that. I just can't stay focused on that one task that long. I tend to rat hole on one sentence and try to get it right instead of just splatting something down on the page and fixing it later. So I think it's great to set a goal for yourself to write for just an hour each day. You'll probably end up doing more, but 1 hour is an approachable goal, and it's something that you're not going to be dreading. And it's something you can always find time for, too. I think for most people, your brain is most creative and most active either early in the morning or late at night. But like exercise, I would recommend trying to get your 1 hour of writing done in the morning. Then it's done for the day. You can move on to other things. Everyone's busy. Get it done early. One more point about interactivity. When I was watching the previous speaker talking about planning out their 3D scenes and how much time they put into the planning aspect of it before they actually started doing anything, I thought that was really good advice that could apply to a lot of disciplines, including this one. For your interactivity, it's so easy to get started on something that seems like you should do it just because you can, just a piece of extra eye candy to add in there. And I think you really want to sanity check that in the early stages so that you don't waste your time creating a lot of gratuitous interactivity and you come up with something that's very useful. You guys are probably great at marketing, but I just have a few tips for you. When you're putting your book on the store, write an engaging description, of course, and include screenshots. I've seen so many books that don't include screenshots. It's crazy. Join the iTunes affiliate program. It's been super useful for me to see who is clicking and buying where. Very valuable. Leverage your network, of course. Tell everyone what you're doing. If you're writing about an area of expertise, like Objective-C, for instance, or web programming, find a blog or a website that writes about that and do a guest post for them. You can also use that to publicize your book. Make a website for your book. Even if it's just one page, it's very important. It's easy for someone to remember csstransformsbook.com. Instead of me giving them a long iTunes URL or saying, oh, just search for my name in the store and then you'll find it, It's great to have a one-page website for that reason, and also because if a user can't purchase an iPad-only book from their iPhone, so Twitter is a great mode for discovering new things, and if you tweet out an iTunes link on Twitter and a user taps it, they're going to see this message that the item is not available, and they're going to have to sort of remember later that they wanted to buy that amazing book that you just wrote. If you have a URL to even just a one-page website, I think that will help you sell more books. So that kind of covers the 3 main points that I wanted to talk to you about today. I hope you found it useful. In conclusion, the points that I want to leave you with are you can connect to a wider audience by branching out to the ebook platform. If you're not a designer, hire a designer and find your point of view for your book. Publicize your work, of course, that's a given. And make a great product that speaks for itself. Just a few links to keep in touch with me on Twitter. If you want email updates, they're at my website, spritelybooks.com. My next book is going to be at cssanimationbook.com. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to James.
Thank you, Vicki. How's everybody doing? Fantastic. Well. My name is James Dempsey, and before I begin, I need to do a little bit of crowdsourcing. So tomorrow evening at the big banquet at Buca di Beppo, we're going to be doing a little bit of music for you all. However, if anybody is local and has an acoustic guitar that they could bring along tomorrow so we could borrow, please see me afterwards and you will get a wonderful, never-before-worn James Dempsey and the Breakpoints t-shirt. Now, also, on that crowdsourcing theme, if you happen to have an amp set up with 4 mics, please see Tim after, and you will also get a t-shirt. If you happen to have both, you still only get 1 t-shirt. Okay, I'll give you 2 t-shirts. So we're going to talk a little bit about accessibility. My name's James Dempsey. I've worked at Apple for 15 years. 5 of those years I worked on accessibility on the desktop, on AppKit. I also was a reviewer of the iOS Accessibility API. And before I jump into the slides, I'd like everybody to do just a little thought experiment with me with a prop. So please just take out your iPhone or whatever iOS device you happen to have handy, and just hold it up so I can see who has it. How many folks are still digging in their pockets? Great, everybody has them. Fantastic. I thought, it being San Francisco and all, let's start out with something a little hippy-dippy. So I'd like you to just hold on to the phone. You can put your hands down. Hold on to it as if you're about to use it. And then I'd just like you to close your eyes for a moment. And as you close your eyes, I'd like you to think about the device you hold in your hand. Just, feel the weight of it in your hand. And think about the last 24 hours. And just think in your mind, imagine or think about all those things that you've done on this device over the past 24 hours. Maybe it was checking email, visiting websites, tweeting, checking in on Foursquare, finding the conference center on Maps. Maybe it was even making a phone call. Just think about all of those things that you did and how you accomplished them, and then I'd like you to narrow your focus down to the thing that you did most often. Might have been sending email, maybe some iMessages, the thing that you did either most often or that was maybe the most important thing, and really think about how you accomplished that task, how you moved your fingers, what you saw on the screen. Just really focus in on that particular task. Excellent. And now what I'd like you to do is imagine if you had to perform that exact same task right now without opening your eyes. How would that work? And now imagine if you needed to spend the next 24 hours accomplishing all of the tasks that you usually accomplish without opening your eyes. And you might be thinking about some issues like, well, it's a completely flat piece of screen, and I have no idea what my finger is on. But even worse, as you think about it, if I put my finger down somewhere and I pick it back up, who knows what I might have just caused to happen? And so with that, if you could open your eyes, thank you very much. You can put away your devices or keep them out. The reason I wanted to take us through that is that I think it's important as app makers every once in a while to literally take a minute or two and remember that the way that you might use an application is not the exact way every user is going to interact with your application. So that will bring us to talk to some accessibility touch points. First, we're going to talk about VoiceOver, dynamic type, guided access, accessibility apps. Now that problem is a very real one. About 5 years ago, Apple announced the iPhone, and the blind community was a little bit worried because of those problems that I described. And in fact, it was only 2 years in to the iPhone that Apple introduced VoiceOver. And VoiceOver essentially takes the interaction, the multi-touch interaction model of every iOS device, gets rid of it, and uses its own interaction model, which we'll talk about just the basics. Well, first, turning on VoiceOver. If you've never visited the accessibility settings in Settings General Accessibility, VoiceOver, we can turn it on there. However, the cool kids are going to scroll down to the bottom and use the accessibility shortcut. Triple click will turn on VoiceOver once you set this, which, if you leave this turned on, will inevitably happen in the most serious moment of every meeting you're in. Yet, it's still a wonderful thing to have on to check the accessibility of your app at a moment's notice. And the basic interaction model, how they solve this problem of a touch screen, is when you turn on VoiceOver, VoiceOver focuses on an element on the screen. And rather than swiping, doing something like scrolling, rather than tapping, doing something like pressing a button, one finger exploring the screen simply moves the cursor to whatever's under the user's finger and describes it for the user. So with one finger, a user is able to figure out what's on the screen. And then once the user has found something that they want to interact with, the user double taps. That double tap doesn't have to happen on the cursor. It can happen anywhere on the screen. And when they double tap, like in this case, it would launch Safari. And then whatever element is selected, and here I use it as an example, the Pages button in the lower right-hand corner, VoiceOver will speak that item. That particular item will say Pages button, so the user knows that their finger has selected the Pages button. Now, VoiceOver has many, many other gestures and shortcuts. We won't get into them, but just this basic interaction lets us talk about the things or how VoiceOver gets its job done and why it's important for you to think a little bit about the accessibility of your app. So how does it work? UIKit has a set of APIs, collectively known as UI accessibility. And it works on the with three main areas, the first being attributes. And when the user puts their finger on a particular spot in the screen, VoiceOver asks your app what element, what item is there, and then it starts asking questions of that element. And it finds out the frame, which is how it can draw the cursor. It asks it for whatever label, how the developer wants it to be described to the user, and any particular traits, which are often just what kind of thing that element is. In this case, we can see that we got all the information to draw the cursor, and also whatever VoiceOver said was obviously stated because of the label and traits. Notifications are another thing an app does to let VoiceOver know when things have changed. If I were to hit that button, and up comes the Pages view controller, VoiceOver needs to know, oh, everything on the screen has changed. I better reread so that the user can navigate this new area. And then finally, there's a notion of actions. One additional gesture that VoiceOver has is a cancel gesture. Just two fingers kind of like in a Z, like a scrub. And for example, in a table view that you've drilled down a few levels, or excuse me, a navigation controller that you've drilled down a few levels, that gesture will take you back up one level. It's called the cancel gesture. And if you're writing an app and you want your widget to handle that gesture, you would implement the accessibility cancel action method. So these three things, attributes on a particular element on the screen, notifications to let VoiceOver know things have changed, and actions, code that you write so that these VoiceOver gestures trigger action or behavior in your code, are really the foundation of how VoiceOver does its thing. Oh, and it went away. Now, I showed you turning on VoiceOver, and VoiceOver only exists on the device itself. When you're doing development, and you might want to check the accessibility of items in the simulator you can go to Settings, General Accessibility, and turn on what's called the Accessibility Inspector, which has that funky psychedelic menu bar kind of thing going on. Now, the Accessibility Inspector exists in the simulator only. And when I click that, what looks like a close button in the corner, it actually expands the Accessibility Inspector. And when it is expanded like this, your simulator will behave as if VoiceOver is on. And in fact, that inspector will show you the various notifications and attributes of the selected item. So that gives you a notion of what's going on with VoiceOver. Now, what about your particular app? What happens when a user downloads your app, turns on VoiceOver, they start moving their thumb around, their finger around? What are they going to hear? First, has anybody done that with their app? A few folks. So a lot of folks, it's a mystery what a blind user, who knows? Fortunately, if you're using UIKit for most of your widgets, UIKit has built-in accessibility support. And for instance, that little area there, the button that we see, UIKit would be able to automatically say, oh, this is a button. It would be able to automatically say, this is its location or its frame. The one thing it would have trouble with is it doesn't know what that button is for. It doesn't have a label. So what I'd like to do now is just walk through a couple of the most common things that you might need to do in an application to make it work better with VoiceOver and provide a great user experience for VoiceOver users. So let's say we have a button, a little refresh button. I just dragged out a UI button and put an image on it and hooked it up to some action method, and voila. At that point, the user of VoiceOver has no idea what that button does. To fix it, we can do that in Interface Builder. In the Identity Inspector, there's an accessibility section. Select that in Interface Builder. We'll just give it a label, refresh. And now VoiceOver, when it runs, will say that's refresh button. And the user has some clue as to what's going on. Now that's great for a UI button, but sometimes you end up, some reason you have a UI view and then you attach, or a UI image view, you turn on user interaction, you put a gesture handler on it to handle a tap, and you basically built your own button. What about a case like that? Yet it looks the same to the user. Well, if we took a look in Interface Builder, it's going to report itself as an image. It doesn't know that it's supposed to be a button. And it's not enabled for accessibility, so accessibility doesn't know it's even supposed to report it. It might be just some background image that the user doesn't really care so much about. So in this case, to get that working for a VoiceOver user, we'd make sure it's enabled so it reports itself. We'd say it is a button, and then we'd add that label. Just a few items. A lot of, shall I put this? You can make an application much more accessible just by spelling out things that are buttons that might not think they're buttons, just by adding labels or hints, which are just a little more description as to what that element does. But sometimes you need to write some code. And a very common thing that happens is sometimes you might write a view or create a view, custom view, that instead of using subviews, you just have a big view, and in draw rect you draw something that's going to handle a click if it's in this, or a tap if it's in this area. You draw some strings, and it's one giant UI view subclass. VoiceOver doesn't know what's going on in that case. In this case, instead of relying on the view hierarchy and the views in it to report what's going on, in iOS, let's say it's a cell view for our movie table. iOS has an informal protocol called UI Accessibility Container, which very much mirrors NSArray. So give me the accessibility child at this particular element. What's the count of accessibility children, etc. In this case, there'd be 4 of them, 3 static text fields and a button. And so we would implement that method to simply create an instance of UI accessibility element, poke in the appropriate information, so which items are buttons, which items are static text, what their frame is, what their label is, and return those. So how do I put it? It's not a terribly onerous amount of work, but it is a bit of work. So before we move on, I wanted to just leave with a couple of thoughts. Sometimes we think about accessibility as a checkbox. Sometimes a checkbox we never quite get to. But remember, for users of VoiceOver, that is their user experience. So if you care about user experience and crafting user experiences, you possibly are giving somebody a horrific user experience. It's much better to turn on VoiceOver, see what's going on, and improve that user experience. But I also mentioned it's not a checkbox, just like interface design isn't a checkbox where version 1 of the app you say, yes, we have an interface, check. Then version 2, we still have an interface, don't have to do anything there. Just as the visual interface is a user experience, so is the experience provided by your app and VoiceOver together. And for that, think about accessibility as part of the development process. Schedule a bit of time in there to do a little bit of voiceover testing. It's not the thing that, Barry does for 2 hours on a weekend when he has free time. It should be part of the process. Now, for native apps, use UIKit where possible. The more custom your views are, the more accessibility work you need to do. As Vicki mentioned, if you have text-heavy or bookish-heavy materials, consider an ebook. Because you provide the text, the iBooks app or the whatever particular reader app is already accessible. So some resources on making your apps accessible, iOS Dev Center, but there are also some great WWDC sessions which will go step-by-step demoing through the code. Does everybody see that okay? So I'm starting to get to the age where everything is looking that small. And I like things a little bit bigger, but honestly, I like things a lot bigger. Again, some users will experience your app with VoiceOver. Some users might have other visual disabilities and want larger type. Dynamic type was introduced in iOS 7, and it's a preference, a user preference, for the user to be able to select between 7 different text sizes, running from extra small to extra, extra, extra large. However, for folks who really need the magnification, you can come to general accessibility larger type and extend the scale even further on the high end. I didn't even go all the way. And they are these settings: accessibility medium through extra, extra, extra large. Now, at the developers conference where dynamic type was introduced, they also introduced a method on UI font where you would ask for it and get back a particular font, but you didn't really have any control over the weight or the size or anything. However, since many of our apps use a custom font, or we are very particular about the design of our apps, pixel perfect, we can use these settings on their own. We can just ask when the app starts up, what's the user's setting for content size? And we can ask to be notified if the user changes that while our app is running. And even if your app has a layout and you really don't want to move between medium and extra, extra, extra large, it's probably a safe bet that if a user went to settings, general, accessibility, larger type, they went to that trouble and then cranked up the size to anything from accessibility medium to accessibility extra, extra, extra large, it's probably an incredibly good bet that they care a lot more about the text being large than they do about the pixel perfect design of your app. And so the user experience, even if you just had a second setting in your app that made the text large, if you found one of these was set, would probably provide a better experience. Something to think about. The next thing I'd like to talk about is something called guided access. Is anybody not familiar with this? Was that a double negative? Guided access is an accessibility feature that is actually useful in many, many ways. if you haven't taken a trip down the accessibility settings panel in a release or two, you may have missed guided access. It's designed from an accessibility standpoint to provide, say, an app for maybe an autistic child so that they can stay in a particular app and not be distracted or not hit the home button and leave the environment. However, as an accessibility feature, just its feature in general, this also allows an app to be put in kiosk mode. So if you have been thinking about some sort of kiosk mode app, but we're not aware of guided access, here it is. You can turn off touch, so you could make it just a display app that the user just sees a slideshow or what have you on an iPad in a display. You can turn off rotation. And you can also turn off the hardware buttons. And then the final thing I'd like to talk about are accessibility apps. These are apps where they meet a need in the accessibility community. One example would be something called Looktel Money Reader, where a blind user used to purchase a piece of hardware to be able to have that scan bills and tell them what bill they have. Looktel Money Reader iPhone app allows them to do the same with the camera of their phone. Now, note two things. First, for a low vision user who might have trouble reading the bill, the font is very, very large. But also for a voiceover reader, it will read out to them because they've made the app accessible. But this is true of all different sorts of user needs. Another example might be Proloquo to Go. For users who have difficulty communicating, they can use this as a communication pad. And this, in combination with guided access, allows them to use it essentially as their communication device. And sometimes voiceover is wonderful, but sometimes you want to just say some text to the user, possibly in an assistive app. They snuck in iOS 7 a whole speech synthesis. I could use it right now. A whole speech synthesis engine in AV speech synthesis. So if you missed this, here it is. It can be a nice foundation for an assistive app. And so I'd like to just conclude, voiceover for everyone it's important to make sure that your app works well with voiceover. Otherwise, a set of users will not be able to use your app. Dynamic type, even if you're just looking at the preference and possibly providing larger type for users who clearly have indicated that they want larger type, that would be a nifty use. Guided access, if you're not aware of it, might open up a new arena or a new set of apps that you could build, even if you're using it more as a kiosk mode as opposed to an accessibility feature. And accessibility apps are an area where you can build an app that solves a real problem for a user in need. And also, they tend to, that's all. I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you, James and Vicki. We have a little bit of time now for questions. And actually, while you think of questions, I've got one for James right off the bat. So we talked about this earlier, the old days of website development and Flash development. And we had all these nice Adobe controls for accessibility, and we didn't use them much because, as I thought at the time, well, blind people aren't going to be using this site anyway, so it doesn't really matter. A few years ago, I met a blind friend and actually watched him interact with technology, and I realized, oh, blind people are using a whole lot of things much more than I thought. I didn't know exactly how the technology worked, And now I feel really bad in retrospect about things I did 10 years ago. And I was wondering how much this has improved basically in terms of iOS doing more work either automatically or semi-automatically to enforce this developer behavior. I mean, are the default UI elements having this checkboxes turned on? I mean, has it gotten any better in the field?
Well, first I'd like to say one thing to your first comment is one thing I did learn in 5 years working in accessibility at Apple is the one thing you never want to do is bet against the spirit of a human being who is trying to accomplish something. Because whether you're helping them or not, they're going to do everything in their power to accomplish that thing. And it's very inspiring to see. But it's even more inspiring when you do help them to accomplish that thing. I think that the accessibility provided out of the box with an iPhone and iOS and iPad are amazing. I think that they've done a lot of work to make the toolkits as accessible as possible. Having worked on Mac accessibility, I know that they took a lot of lessons learned there to make it easier to make an app accessible in iOS. I think it has made a difference.
Okay, so it's not perhaps perfect, but it's better than, say, when I was writing websites.
Absolutely. But it's also the case that when I was working, I had somebody say, why would somebody want the font panel to be accessible? Why would blind folks be using fonts? It's like, well, one, people know, like, not everybody who's blind has always been blind. I've met blind photographers, professional photographers. You never know how people are going to be using the tools that you provide. And it's a shame to limit them because it escapes your imagination that somebody might be able to do something with the tool that you've created.
I've got a format question for Vicki, but does anybody else have questions in the audience? There's one. I'm sorry, there's two. Do you, well, okay. You, then you, I'm sorry.
A question about how VoiceOver interacts with localization. Can I use base localizations to get it? And also, are there ways to provide phonetic pronunciations or their recommendations for how to deal with something that maybe VoiceOver can't pronounce correctly, or maybe it's a homophone?
So that's two great questions. VoiceOver speaks, is it now 30, 50? A lot of languages. So your localizations will carry over into VoiceOver. They added a new accessibility label property as a category on NSString. So if you have a string and you wanted it to be pronounced a certain way, you could actually put a label with the phonetic spelling. Might be one approach that you could use. Yeah, sounds good.
Question in the front stage right here.
Has there been much work done on making VoiceOver suck less for text entry? And is there anything that, as a developer, that we could even do to that?
That not working at Apple at the moment, and even if I did, I couldn't tell you then, and now I really can't tell you because I don't even know. I know they're always looking at making things better, but I don't have any details. However, filing feedback, because one of the ways Apple finds out people are dissatisfied is reports, bug reports, enhancement requests.
One there.
A question for Vicki. There's been some talk about analytics for ebooks. The press likes to call it books reading their readers. And I wonder, is that a capability that's in EPUB? And if so, how does that work?
So there's nothing that I know of that's built in. You could theoretically, detect a tap on an element and store a piece of data somewhere, or use XHR to send data up to a cloud somewhere. But there's nothing that is, and you'd have to use CORS to identify which server you're talking to, make that cross-server or cross communication work well. So there's nothing built in. You'd have to roll it all yourself, as far as I know.
So, straightforward question for Vicki. You recommended iBooks Author. Clearly you used that, and it's a nice way to go. For the other two formats, for flowing books and for fixed layout, any comments on recommended tools for doing it or services? I know there are conversion services as well.
I'm probably the wrong person to ask about that. Just personality-wise, I'm probably the wrong person because I like to have the most control over everything.
And you know all that, so you just code it. Yeah.
So, you know, there are lots of great frameworks out, just general web frameworks that kind of eliminate work that you would do in a website, you know, eliminate a lot of work for you, make a lot of things easy. And I'm sure some of those would be powerful inside of a book. You'd have to test them out to make sure that they work properly. So I think that a good starting point would probably be some of the tools that you would use to progress quickly when you're making a web page. Some of those same tools might help you inside of an EPUB. But
Tools like what?
Like different JavaScript frameworks that are out there. There's Hype by Tumult that a lot of people are using to build HTML widgets inside of iBooks Author. Producer is a tool from Apple that actually also lets you build HTML widgets for use inside of an iBooks Author book. Those are probably the two best, you know, GUI tools that I can
Hype
think of.
and iBook Producer?
Producer is the name of it, IAD Producer, and Hype by Tumult I think is also good.
Okay, we're going to have to go to a break now and then come back for the next session. Don't forget your